We sent our troops to Iraq to do away with Saddam Hussein's regime, and you got the job done. We kept our troops in Iraq to help establish a sovereign government, and you got the job done. And we will leave the Iraqi people with a hard-earned opportunity to live a better life. That is your achievement. That is the prospect that you have made possible.
A significant portion of the president's address on Iraq today. I want to go back to General McCaffrey and Colonel Jacobs. First to you, General. That's a significant statement. What was he declaring during that part of the speech?
Well, you know, I think there was a danger of over-interpreting the rhetoric here. Being an expert on 8 years of weasel words about the war in Iraq, I thought this was absolutely straightforward. There were some definite dates here. There was a common sense sort of statement of where we are, an extrapolation of where we'll be when we leave. I don't think this was not a two-ball bounce here. This was a straightforward presentation. And by the way, I think from the military audience, this was a home run. It literally brought tears to my eyes to listen to him recognize, you know, we got to remind ourselves, 36,000 killed and wounded. So there's a huge sunk cost. Those Marines are listening to his speech with a very different perspective than some of us.
Fair point, General, but I want to push back in this regard. We just had a brutal campaign during which Iraq was a central part of this debate, and the subtext of that debate was that the war wasn't worth it. So here you have the President of the United States, who is doing more than paying tribute to fallen soldiers and to the sacrifices of military families. He is pointing to concrete gains achieved in the course of this conflict that will endure. That is a significant statement, it seems to me, from a Democratic president who was widely critical of his predecessor who initiated this war. Fair?
Well, I think you can hold these two ideas at the same time. He's standing where he is. He's stating, here's the situation, and here's how we're going to get out of Iraq. So that part, I wouldn't underestimate the thought that by the end of 2011, he says we're gone. Yeah, the Iraqis can come back to us and probably will and say stay with air power, etc. But I thought some of this was unequivocal, surprising to me, and beautifully delivered.
Colonel Jacobs, comment on that?
Well, there are a lot of things going on at the same time. The Iraqis can come back. He can't. President Obama can't stand in front of a bunch of Marines and say, we're getting out, and by the way, your sacrifice doesn't mean anything. So he's got to say something, and did say something very eloquent about the sacrifice of the young men and women who served us so well during this difficult time. But things can change, and my bet is that they will change. And there's one other thing to keep in mind. We don't have enough soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. We've got another front on this war, and he's got to get some of these people out of Iraq so that we can do things in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I think it all came into a very convincing package, and he did it well.
Tom Ricks, I think a lot of Americans at this point are wrestling with a central question, which is, did we win? And the second question is, what is the Iraq that we're leaving? Did we leave it in a better place that helps us, that helps the region?
We won't know for 10 or 15 years whether we actually did something right. Even in removing Saddam Hussein, we may well end up with a strong man, stronger than Saddam, closer to Tehran, and certainly will be anti-American. That's in some ways the best case scenario if the country holds together. The speech overall, though, I think what he was saying with that kind of mission accomplished type phraseology was, I don't want to argue about it anymore. That's behind us all. Let's talk about the next couple of years, not the last 8.
Jim Miklaszewski, that's such a significant point, because there certainly are a lot of Democrats and a lot of supporters of Obama who would certainly like to debate it some more and debate how the country got into the war. So a significant statement, if it's kind of a concluding point for Obama, that we now need to focus on the future and just ending the war.
Well, not only that, but senior Pentagon officials and senior military commanders who have actually sat across the table from President Obama in these discussions about both Iraq and Afghanistan say there's a huge difference between Obama as a candidate and Obama as a commander-in-chief, that he comes to the table well-informed, and he's a good listener, and his responses are measured. And I want to point out one thing that he said about the lessons learned in Iraq, that we must go to war with with very clearly defined goals. In the first discussion he had with his military commanders over at the White House about the strategy in Afghanistan, at the end of that discussion, he turned and looked at everybody, according to sources who were there, and said, "Gentlemen, what is our end game in Afghanistan?" And nobody had a clear-cut answer. Hence, he immediately ordered a widespread overall review of the strategy in Afghanistan. He, in the past month or so, has gained widespread respect among the senior military commanders that we've talked to.
Ken, is there any measure of vindication here for the former president, whether it's just on the narrow issue of the surge, which that's not so narrow, that's a pretty significant policy area, or on the outcome for Iraq overall?
Well, I don't doubt that President Bush and many people who served him are going to claim tremendous vindication from this speech. I think that they're going to pick up on a whole variety of points and hold it up and say, see, this is just like what Bush said at different points in time. But again, I think that, you know, we as a nation need to reserve judgment. Go back to a point Tom made. I think it's absolutely right. Whenever I get asked, was the war worth it? I always like to cite Chou En-lai, who famously, when asked, was the French Revolution good for humanity, 100 years after the fact, 150 years after the fact, famously replied, it's too soon to tell. You know, there are a lot of things going right in Iraq, but there's still a lot of things that can go wrong. And it's going to take 5, 10, 15 years for them to play out. I would actually disagree with Tom. I think the scenario he laid out is actually a fairly likely scenario, but it's absolutely not the best case. There are forces of Iraqi nationalism, and even you can see in Iraq today the forces of democratization taking hold and completely transforming politics. I mean, when I was just in Baghdad last week, Prime Minister Maliki is all about getting electricity and clean water to his people. That was something that Iraqi leaders couldn't have cared less about 2 years ago. And the reason that they're doing it is because they've got elections and they know they've got to get votes. That's a big change.
About 30 seconds, Chuck, on the politics going forward, and another thought if you have it.
Well, no, I was talking to a senior official before the joint session speech, which, oh, by the way, took place this week too, and they said to me, keep an eye on that speech that the president will give on Friday about Iraq. Months from now, perhaps years from now, that will be the most significant speech that he gave this week, and trying to not downplay the joint session speech, but trying to underscore the importance that this speech was going to live. We're getting a blueprint, Mick pointed out, a blueprint for how he will conduct foreign policy, I think, going forward and make military decisions, but also it's a significant thing to say that he's going to end the war. He said it two different times. He said ending the war in Iraq.
And also respect for the Iraqi people, something highlighted as well. Chuck Todd, thank you very much. Ken Pollack. Tom Ricks, the latest book is The Gamble. Congratulations on that. Jim Miklaszewski, thank you very much. General Barry McCaffrey and Col Jack Jacobs. That's going to do it for our coverage of this speech by President Obama on the Iraq War. I'm David